she went into labor in the snowstorm, and the one who delivered her child was a man who hadn't held another's hand in 10 years. An old man had lived in silence for 9 winters, still pouring 2 cups of tea each morning, one for someone who'd never return, until one night, in the heart of a blizzard, a pregnant girl appeared, sold like livestock, barely human in the eyes of the world. What followed between them would become one of the quietest, most stirring stories the West ever knew. Before the sun crested the ridge, the sound of fire already crackled through the old wooden kitchen. The dim light from the oil lamp cast long, silvered scratches on the walls, marks worn down like stories no one told anymore. Gideon Ross held the brass kettle with both hands, pouring freshly boiled water into an old tin percolator, every motion deliberate, as if each drip carried a promise he hadn't yet found the courage to release. On the small table by the window sat 2 mugs. One was his, handle broken, rim chipped, the deer stamped at the bottom now faded to a ghost. The other, still whole, was always placed across from him, directly in front of an empty rocking chair. No one sat there, no one had for 12 years, yet every morning he brewed 2 cups, placed them just so, as if failing to do so would cause that last thread of him, husband, father, man with a home, to dissolve into smoke and ash. Outside, snow blanketed the slopes. Late December in Colorado left the world only in shades of white and gray. Old pines stood bare and frozen like statues. The cattle had been penned in the night before, chewing slowly through the hay he'd stacked in summer. Gideon didn't speak much, and he needed no one to know he was still alive. People in town said, "Old Ross had a wife once and a kid." Then came the sickness. He stayed. They didn't. No one knew more. He never explained, never defended. When someone did come by, he greeted them with a nod, poured a warm pot of tea, and let silence stretch out like a frozen lake, clear, unmoving, and offering no reflection. After rinsing the mugs, he stepped onto the porch. The sky was still dark. Wind howled through the valley like a wounded horse crying out in sleep. He sat on the rocking chair, boots propped on the railing, one hand around his cup, still faintly warm. The other cup remained on the small table by the door, never emptied, never cold. Gideon didn't believe in locks. The front door to his cabin hadn't been latched in 12 years. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because he understood something bone deep. Real sorrow doesn't knock. It walks in like it already belongs. In that dim morning light, he looked down at his hands, cracked with soot, calloused by wood and winter. These were the hands that once held his child, that had hesitated to hand his dying wife a drink of water, afraid the sickness might drift to the baby asleep. The next room. He had never told a soul that his greatest shame wasn't losing them, but surviving them, still waking, still breathing, and staring every day at a cup that would never be touched again. That was the sentence. As the first light stretched across the snow, he stood and brought both cups inside. No more warmth, only the dark stain at the bottom and a faint smoke clinging to his palms. No cries, no voices, only wind slipping through the cracks and the dying breath of coals. As if something had been burning all night, unnoticed. In that moment he did not yet know that another life was on its way, cold, bleeding, with eyes that had nothing left to lose, and that today would be the last morning he brewed coffee for the dead, and the first for someone who'd never once been treated like she was human. That night the wind shifted, not colder, cold was a given here, but gentler somehow, like it wasn't trying to break in, only to slip between the seams of the wooden house and whisper. Gideon was latching the last stall door in the barn when he froze. Something was off. A sound that wasn't wind, wasn't branches, wasn't any animal. It sounded like metal scraping across snow. He lifted his head, tilted his ear, eyes narrowing into the thick white falling hard from the hillside. He saw nothing, but his chest clenched the way it always did when he stepped into the room on the left. He fastened the latch, unhooked the oil lamp from its nail, and stepped quietly toward the woods behind the barn. Snow reached his ankles. The wind came from the east, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant, half-burnt smoke. He moved slowly without sound, a man long accustomed to the hush of a place no one bothered to name. Then he saw it, a shape curled near the path marker where he always planted the snow stake each winter. A girl, lying on her side, a dark brown stain blooming into the white, blood on snow, her legs bent wrong, and her belly, round and swollen like harvest trying to rise from dead earth. Gideon knelt. The oil lamp trembled in the wind. Her face was covered in mud and tangled hair. She wasn't unconscious. Her eyes were open, hollow as a beaten animal's, void of defense, void of pleading, not surrender, just nothing left worth holding on to. He saw the red marks of rope around her wrists, cut deep and raw, her legs scratched and bleeding, heels cracked, fingernails filled with dirt. As if she'd been dragged for miles, not by hands, but by someone's indifference. The dress she wore wasn't long enough to cover her belly, and not whole enough to cover her dignity. Gideon didn't ask a single question, didn't look around for whoever had done this, because the girl's body alone was enough evidence of the crime. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her, and lifted her, lighter than a sack of hay. She didn't resist, just breathed barely, a thin whisper like smoke, the kind cold itself tries to steal away. Her hand landed on her belly, not to protect, just to check that it was still there. Gideon trudged through the snow, his boots sinking deeper with each step. No one saw, no one asked. But for the first time in 12 years, he opened the grain shed, a place no soul had entered since his wife and child left. He laid her down on the dry hay near the iron stove, quietly lit the fire, not with matches, not with paper, the old way, flint and dry bark, because to him nothing about salvation was new, only old things used again, if a man still had heart enough to try. The flame caught, she shivered once, then went still. Gideon pulled an old wool blanket over her, tucking it from feet to shoulders. Then he backed away and sat in the corner of the shed, his back against a sack of oats, the oil lamp still glowing in his hand. The light didn't touch his face. It only spilled across his left hand, the one still calloused from that day. He refused to hand his wife a cup of water, afraid to pass the sickness to the child sleeping in the next room, and lived long enough to remember it forever. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, a crack had opened, not in the wall, but in the heart of a man who once believed no one should be saved again. Gideon didn't sleep. He just sat there at the base of the stairs, a revolver resting near, fingers gently curled around the worn grip, not out of fear, but because he no longer knew what else to do with the hands that once created silence. The fire in the cast-iron stove was dying, but its glow still flickered against the warped beams above. He heard the wind outside scraping the walls, though the storm inside him had started long before, the moment he lifted that girl from the snow. Near dawn, with frost still clinging to the hinges, the first sound came from her, not speech, but a faint, thread-thin breath, a cough, then stillness. Gideon rose, opened the hatch above the stove, where a kettle always waited. He poured half a tin of warm water, not too hot, not too cold, and placed it near her hand. No urging, no words. She woke, but not with a start. She didn't ask where she was. The pale morning light filtered through the frosted window, landing across her face, drawn, raw, but somehow unshattered. She tried to sit, hesitating as her belly pulled tight. Her lips were cracked, Her eyes took in the space, the wood stove, the grain sacks, the cast iron, the thick coat now covering her legs. She reached out and touched the fabric, fingers lingering, as if she recognized it had once belonged to someone else, or once been used to keep someone else warm. Gideon said nothing. He stood with his back to a support beam, holding in his arms a shirt his wife had sewn, one he'd meant to use to line the bedding for winter pups. But now, maybe it'd be used to warm the back of someone trembling like leaves in the wind. They didn't ask names. No, who are you? No, what am I to you? Only a glance, her eyes drifting across his left hand, rough from wrist to fingertip, a scar running across the base of the thumb, skin darkened by years of snow and fire. And something in her gaze softened, as if she had once known a man with hands like that, before everything was twisted by trade, violence, and the invisible slap called silence. Gideon turned, drew another blanket from above the stove, and looked toward the room on the left. A door unopened in 12 long years. The wood still bore its old paint. The latch hung a little loose. The wind tapped gently against it. He placed his hand on the lock, but didn't open it. He just exhaled, deep and low, then turned back and laid the blanket down on the floor beside the stove. Just far enough from her mattress to keep distance, just near enough for the warmth to reach them both. Before sitting, he unclipped the gun from his belt, set it well out of reach, and turned his face toward the door. No words, just motion. Like a man who once did wrong and now sought no pardon through speech, but through where he chose to sit. The girl turned toward the fire. Her shoulders still trembled, not from cold, but from something warmer and stranger than pain, to be treated as if she still mattered. Outside, the sky began to pale, and for the first time in over a decade, Gideon Ross, a man who had lived alone with memory, did not brew 2 cups of coffee, because maybe, just maybe, the second cup had found someone to drink it. The second day passed in silence. No one asked what had happened to her before she collapsed in the snow. No one explained why the chair on the left side of the dining table had been empty for over a decade. Only the fire was lit twice. Water kept within her reach, and a bone broth simmered near the iron stove. No invitation, no need to go first. Elsie wasn't used to that. She wasn't used to silence that didn't demand anything. She wasn't used to a house without locks that still felt safe enough to sleep in without a knife tucked under her pillow. That night, while Gideon added wood to the fire, she reached for a jacket he'd left near the old calf cradle, where he once laid a newborn dairy calf to warm last spring. The left cuff of the coat was torn. She didn't ask, didn't wait for permission. She simply pulled a spool of gray thread from her dress pocket, threaded a needle already rusted at the tip, and began to stitch. Small, patient passes, as if she were sewing up a memory of her own that had come apart at the seams. When Gideon returned, he paused at the sight. A small hand, steady, mending something that belonged to a man who hadn't spoken her name. He said nothing, just laid the firewood beside the stove and stepped back into the quiet. The next morning, something small happened, but it shifted the air in the house. Gideon had just lit a cigarette, an old habit, when Elsie lurched forward and vomited on the floor. She backed away, one hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Not at the smoke itself, but at the memory tied to it. That smell, cheap tobacco, was the same her brother used to smoke. It clung to his coat the night he shoved her into the truck. The night he said, voice flat and cold, "I need the gun, and you now belong to him." She didn't speak, but her body curled like an animal caught in a snare. Gideon saw, didn't ask, didn't explain. He ground the cigarette out on the hearthstone and walked out onto the porch. When he came back, he held a small bundle, the half-used pouch of tobacco. and tossed it straight into the fire. No applause, no tears, but from that moment on, the house never smelled of smoke again. That evening, something sat on the table. A thick square of cow-brown wool, neatly knit, no words, no note. Elsie sat, looked at it, realized it was exactly the size of her left wrist. The same wrist that still bore the faint red line from the rope that bound her when she was sold. She didn't cry. She simply placed it on her arm, wrapped it once around, and tightened it herself. It didn't feel like a bracelet. It felt like someone, in silence, had told her, "You're not bound anymore." That night, Elsie slept, truly slept, for the first time since the 3rd month of her pregnancy. No twitching, no moans, just slow, steady breathing, in time with the fire's soft crackle. And Gideon, he sat a few paces away, never leaving his old wooden chair, a carving knife in hand. On the smooth pine blade he was whittling, he began to carve a word, not hope, not yet belong, just an old word, one he once meant to carve for himself, but never found the courage to. Warm. Winter reached its cruelest stretch. Snow fell for 3 days straight, then hardened into ice. The wind howled like a starving beast, slipping through the rafters, screeching at the windows like breath caught in a throat. Gideon's old house had never been warm, but it had never been this cold. And never in 12 years had he lit the fire 3 times in a single day. Elsie didn't leave the room by the stove. She sat by the coal burner, both hands resting on her belly, as if trying to hold on to the one thing left unbroken in a body that had been dragged through slush and bartered like cattle. Each morning she helped Gideon wash the mugs, hang the blankets, stack firewood. Small things, quiet things, done with the devotion of someone who believed that earning a place meant never assuming it. One day Gideon climbed to the attic. He stood there for a long time beside a door that hadn't been opened. The room that had once belonged to his wife and daughter, still locked. Dust on the handle. He didn't enter. Instead, he turned into the side loft, where broken things were kept. Scrap lumber, old furniture, and a pine cradle missing one leg. It had once held his daughter, and it had become the one thing he could neither throw away nor bring himself to fix. That day, Gideon brought the cradle down. No one asked him to. No one said she'd be staying. Nothing guaranteed the child would survive the winter, but he dusted it anyway, washed it with warm water, set it out to dry beneath the porch, and then, with bare hands, mended the broken leg, filing the wood, sanding edges, tapping in each nail himself. Not a word spoken. That afternoon, as she stepped out for water, Elsie froze. The cradle was by the stove, cleaned, repaired, lined with thick cloth. On the inner rail, freshly carved, were 2 small words: "Stay warm." She stood still, tin cup in hand, not raised, just looking at it as if she had never seen anyone do something for her, without expecting anything in return. No rescue, no promises, only this: "There's a fire here. If you want, you may stay until you feel warm again." That evening, when Gideon returned from mucking the stalls, she had already folded a small handkerchief, an unfinished red thread sewn in one corner. She laid it in the cradle, not as a thank you, but as a quiet reply. "I believe something could sleep here, and I want it to." They said nothing during supper. The wind cried at the porch. The fire snapped softly in the hearth. Much later, Gideon looked up from his bowl and said, "I didn't fix the cradle for anyone. I fixed it because it was broken." She didn't look at him, only smiled. Not brightly, but it was the first smile she'd worn since girlhood. The fire held steady. Snow still fell, and in a house that hadn't heard the sound of a child in over a decade, for the first time, a man kept the fire burning. Not for himself. That night, the snow ceased, but the silence grew heavy, dense as if the whole land held its breath before a storm that had no name. No branches cracked, no owls called from the valley, only that weight in the air, thick as lead, announcing something was coming. Not wind, not beast, but men, and men, when they carry bad intent, make the world quiet before they arrive. Gideon was sharpening his axe behind the house when he heard the hooves. Not one, several. The rhythm was slow, steady, the cadence of those who knew they were hunting. He stood, hand tightening around the haft, not from fear, but because he knew. Some things can't be avoided by simply turning away. The front door eased open. Elsie stood there, arms around a water basin, eyes locked on the black beyond the porch. For a breathless second, she shrank, back to the day she was dragged through snow, wrists bleeding, the sound of men laughing as they named her like livestock. They've come, she thought, her heart pounding. I'm not worth what he'll risk. Her fear wasn't just being taken. It was pulling the only man who had ever seen her as human into the darkness of a past she could never erase. Gideon looked at her. No words, just a glance. She nodded, then slipped into the back room, wrapped the baby tight in blankets, and stepped into the narrow crawl space behind the hearth. It had once been used to store salt, cramped, cold, but sealed like a vow. She curled inside the dark, hands on her belly, breath trembling. Every sound from outside, wind, boots, felt like a blade scraping open the old voices. You're just property. No one wants you beyond what you're worth. She bit her lip to stifle the tears, but deep down the question returned. Am I worth the price he might pay? 3 men dismounted. They climbed the porch with the smell of wet hide, cheap whiskey, and gunpowder. The scent of men who live by stepping on others. Gideon opened the door, not lowering his gaze. He stepped back only once, just enough for the oil lamp to cast full light on every face. The one in front wore a gray wool coat, high collar, eyes sharp as blades. A man used to signing papers that turned people into things. He raised a warrant. No name, no photo, just words. White female, early 20s, pregnant, stolen property of Wilson Barrett. Gideon didn't look at the paper. He stood as still as stone. She's here, the man said, voice like steel drawn in winter air. No reply. The second man, short, broad, whip in hand, stepped to the side, sneering. Just a quick look, old man. If she's not here, we move on. Gideon's eyes shifted toward the stove, where the door stood ajar, fire still burning. He moved, slow, as if only to stoke it, then slid the bolt on the stoveroom shut. She's not here, he said, voice rough, not loud, but it stopped all 3 men in their breath. The third muttered nervously. That's Gideon Ross. He's been alone since the plague, buried his whole family by himself. The man with the whip clenched his hand. His eyes flashed with the contempt of someone used to breaking weaker things. Gideon set the axe on the table, not hidden, not threatening, just placed. I don't hide people and I don't sell people. But if any of you believe a pregnant woman is property, he said, his voice steady, then you'd best be gone before the snow melts. Silence. Wind howled through the boards, like the wail of the forgotten. Those once tied to trees, no one came to untie. The 3 men looked at each other. No one moved. Gideon stood tall, not for himself, but for the woman curled in the salt hollow, holding a child who would never again be called a possession. After a long moment, they turned. Not from fear, but from his eyes, the eyes of a man who had once watched his family die in his hands and would not let it happen again. When the hoofbeats finally faded, Gideon opened the hatch. Elsie looked up, eyes wet, but not weak. Her arms still crossed her chest, where her heart beat loud as if declaring, I'm still here. He nodded, only said, next time, we don't hide. The next morning dawned clear, but no bird sang. No animal crossed the old path. Gideon placed a hand against the wood beside the door. A rifle had hung there for 10 years. Now it came down. Dust slid from the barrel like old snow. Elsie stirred a pot of porridge, her hands slowing every time the wind picked up. In her mind, her brother's face returned. The man who'd sold her for the price of a gun. He won't let go, she thought, her fingers tightening around the wooden ladle. I'm only a burden. He shouldn't have to pay for me. The fear in her chest wasn't just of being taken, but of the quiet belief that she wasn't worth the risk Gideon would surely take. 3 hours by horse in a town smeared with ink and hunger, Wilson Barrett got the message. The girl's being sheltered, the whisper said, by Ross, the one who's not afraid of dying. Barrett didn't shout. His lips curled into a grin, cold as a coin fresh from the mint. He made his wealth buying and selling those no one would miss, and Elsie wasn't the first. If the old man wants to keep that piece of merchandise, he said, voice slick from years of naming people by price, then let him learn what interfering costs. By dusk, Gideon had lashed water sacks along the fence, an old fire break trick from drier years. No one spoke of flames, but the red glare in the sky clung to his eyes longer than it should have. Night fell. No moon. Wind scratched the walls like the fingernails of the desperate. Then came a flicker of light near the tree line. 1, then 2, then 3. Elsie was humming to the baby when she heard Gideon descend the stairs. He entered wearing the old hunting coat, the one buried in the chest since the day his wife and daughter were laid to rest. He placed a small pouch on the table. If I don't come back, he said, go upstream. The French camp will help. Elsie rose, sharp. I won't let you go alone. He looked at her, not angry, just steady. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I'm only standing outside so they know this house isn't empty. He stepped onto the porch, unarmed. Faced the dark. Wind blew ash from the hearth across his face. The face of a man who had once watched death take everything and never raised his voice against it. 4 figures approached, 2 on horseback, 2 on foot. Leading them was Barrett's cousin, eyes bloodshot from whiskey and the arrogance of a man who'd never been denied. He had once shot deer just to laugh, once whipped a native man just to hear him cry. The others were lean, hungry, but their eyes gleamed with the cruelty of men who survive by taking. When they saw Gideon, no weapon, no fear, they slowed. No one shouted, but the yard grew heavy with a silence so full it groaned beneath the frost. Gideon spoke. Tonight you can turn back. Hold onto whatever piece of soul you still have. Or stay and lose it for good. 3 of them faltered, eyes shifting like beasts catching the scent of something stronger than them. But the cousin, a man who'd lived by blood and the illusion of ownership, drew his blade. You think you can stop me from taking what belongs to my employer? He spat. Gideon didn't move, didn't blink, just looked at him. With the eyes of a man who had already lost everything once and would not lose again. No one saw what happened. There was only one cry, short, sharp, then silence. The other 3 ran, not out of fear, but because they understood. The man on that porch wasn't defending himself. He was defending something far greater. By morning there was no body, only deep footprints in the snow and a bloodied handkerchief tied to the fence rail, a sign clear as scripture. This land does not welcome men who treat people as property. Elsie brought a basin of water to the porch. Gideon sat there, blood on his hands, but his eyes were brighter than they'd been in all the silent months before. She sat beside him, didn't touch, didn't ask, just sat the way people do when there's nothing left to say, but everything finally understood. That morning the snow had stopped. The wind pulled back from the tree line, leaving behind a stillness so pure it felt unnatural. No hoofprints, no strange footsteps, only a house and two people inside it, as if nothing terrible had happened. But both knew it had, and that it was over. Gideon sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the white-draped field. Inside, Elsie stood in the doorway. Her hands cradled a cup of warm tea. Her eyes watched him, but she wasn't sure if she should step out. Inside her still echoed the memories, the nights she was bound, dragged, looked at with contempt. Every step toward daylight felt like a small rebellion, not against whips or shouts, but against the shame and self-loathing that had buried her deeper than chains ever could. She stepped out, one step, then another. The cold clawed at her collar, but she did not retreat. Gideon didn't turn, but when she sat down beside him on the porch step, he lifted the teapot, poured a cup, and nudged it toward her. No words, no glance, just a gesture, one human to another. Elsie accepted it, her hands trembling slightly. No one had ever poured her tea without asking for something in return. She had lain beside spilled whiskey, heard the roar of drunken laughter, suffered the slicing humor of men who saw her as nothing but a tool to be spent. But today, the cup was warm, silent, placed in her hands as if it belonged there. And she began to cry, not loud, just tears welling, blurring the pale morning light. Not from wind, but because for the first time in her life, someone had shown her kindness without reason. Gideon didn't touch her shoulder, didn't ask what for. He simply sat there, eyes on the snow that had yet to melt, so she would know. She could lift her head, or lower it. She could cry, or hold it in. Whatever she chose, he would still be beside her. When the sun crept past the eaves and landed on her cheek, Elsie turned slightly to look at him. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, just barely. Perhaps it was thank you, perhaps it was I'm still alive. After that morning, she began stepping outside each day, even if only to sweep the porch, even if only to fill the hen's water, even if only to gather greens from the stream bank. The child inside her, once the excuse they used to sell her, now became the reason she chose to live. Because someone was waiting for her each morning, because the tea was still poured, even if he never said a word. And deep within her, something like pride began to take root, not loud, not boastful, but the quiet pride of someone who had once been sold, and now knew at last she was no longer a thing. January slipped into February as snow gave way to mud and thaw. The deer began moving lower along the hills. Mist clung longer to the roofline, and inside that small wooden house, life began to find a rhythm. Elsie no longer moved like a ghost in the corners. She wiped down the stove, peeled potatoes, aired out the old blankets molded from last winter. She did each task with the care of someone preparing a place, and she was. The child in her belly grew by the day. No one spoke of it, but the house knew. Gideon quietly carved a small chair from pine. He didn't ask, didn't explain. He simply placed it near the hearth, as if it had always belonged there. When Elsie saw it, she stood frozen for a long while, not because of the chair itself, but because he had believed that the child would be born here, would live here, would have a right to sit in this world. In the still afternoons, she sat sewing. He carved a new handle for the hoe. Silence filled the room, not the silence of strangers, but of two people who had survived and were slowly learning to breathe alongside one another. Once she dropped the water bucket. He stepped forward, lifted it. She clenched her jaw, waiting for reproach, like the kind she'd always known, but he only said, soft as wood smoke, ankles swollen." "Sit down." And so she did, not because of the ache, but because for the first time in her life, she was allowed to be tired. No one demanded, no one judged. There was only a house and a quiet man pouring more water into the kettle. Sometimes he'd leave at dawn to hunt, gone half the day. And when he returned, she had made soup with whatever scraps remained. It wasn't good, but it smelled like someone had decided to stay. One night, the wind howled through the valley, long and low like wolves mourning their dead. She couldn't sleep. The fire had dimmed. The room had gone cold. He rose without a word, added logs to the stove, didn't look at her, didn't speak, but that small act, it undid her. She wept. She had never lived in a place where the fire was fed because she was cold. She had been called trouble, a burden, a thing to be gotten rid of. But the child in her belly had changed something, had made someone treat her like a person. She placed her hand over the rise of her stomach and whispered, though no sound left her lips, not to him, but to the baby. "You came at the right time. I used to be no one, but because of you, I was allowed to stay." The day began with a small omen, a crow landing on the roof beam, cawing 3 times. Gideon, mid-swing at the chopping block, froze. He wasn't a superstitious man. But out west, you learn to listen to things that don't speak aloud. By late afternoon, the sky bruised purple-gray. Not snow this time, but a wind dry and raw, dragging dust down the wagon ruts, places no one should have come from anymore. He killed the fire early, fetched the rifle he hadn't touched in years, pulled the curtain tight across the window. Night fell. Only the sound of hearts beating remained. Then hooves, unhurried, unhidden, the sound of a man certain he held the upper hand. 3 shadows emerged, thin, hungry, with the glint in their eyes that comes from taking more than you ever earn. At the front was the man who had once sold Elsie, her brother, the man who traded her for a rifle and a few silver coins. His eyes were murky, not from drink, but from a soul long corroded by selfishness. He wasn't here for money anymore. He came because something he thought he owned had slipped from his grip, and that was a wound pride would not forgive. Gideon sat by the door, rifle across his knees. Elsie huddled in the corner, arms around her belly, not shaking from fear, but because an old wound had been stirred. "He's here for me," she thought, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not worth him paying the price again." Memories flashed, being dragged, being called property. The sting of old names lashed like whips across the inside of her skull. The brother's voice cracked the air, gravel scraping gravel. "Heard you're living well, Elsie? You owe me. Time to pay up." Silence from her, from the old man. He stepped closer, boots tracking mud across the threshold. Gideon stood, didn't raise the gun. Only said, "That child she carries is the only shot you have left at any kind of honor." The man laughed, a dry, splintering sound, like rotten timber splitting in fire. "You think she's worth anything," he spat, his eyes burning with the cruelty of men who've long since forgotten how to see people as anything but weight to trade. That sentence cut sharper than any blade. No one saw what happened next, only the crack of a rifle, sharp, cold as steel in a shallow grave. Then stillness, not the silence of fear, the silence of an ending. The 2 others ran, not out of cowardice, but because they realized this man didn't stand for himself. He stood for something they'd never understand. Kindness without transaction. Gideon didn't crow with victory, didn't burn with rage. He stood at the door like a man tending flame in the middle of a snowstorm. Not for warmth, but because the fire had to be kept. Later he dug the grave behind the house, near the pines. No one watched. No thanks needed. The dirt swallowed what it must. and all that remained were his calloused hands and a winter still unfinished. Elsie sat by the hearth. The fire burned steady, but her heart, for the first time, ached not from shame but from something plain and human. It simply hurt, and this time it deserved to. For 3 days after, the snow came in fits. Light scattered. No one left the house. No one spoke of the night before. Only the steady burn of the fire, the quiet pop of kindling, and the faint scent of weak tea in the air. Gideon didn't ask. Elsie didn't tell. They didn't need to. Out west, some things are best kept in silence, like seeds held through winter waiting for the thaw. The old man rose earlier than usual. He cleaned out the horse stall, stacked extra wood near the door, patched a section of the porch roof with bare hands. Not because it was urgent, but because spring was coming, and life, sooner or later, would need a place to return to. Elsie began sewing clothes for the baby. Scraps of fabric, uneven stitches, but her hands, for the first time, didn't tremble when touching something small, something waiting to be protected. One morning she stepped onto the porch and looked out across the gorge. Mist clung to the air. No wind. The sky washed clean, as if after years of dust, it had finally remembered how to be blue. Gideon was splitting wood. When he looked up and saw her, he paused, just a moment. Elsie said, "Thank you, for not asking anything." He nodded just once, then turned away. Because a man his age doesn't always have the words when someone younger begins to lift their head. She no longer hid in the corners of the kitchen. She stepped into the yard, pulled weeds, fed the hens. No one asked her to. But when someone treats you like a human being, there comes a day, quiet and unannounced, when you begin to live like one. One night the cold sank deeper. Elsie added wood to the fire, pulled an extra blanket over his shoulders. Gideon watched her for a long time. "You don't have to do that," she replied. "No one has to do anything for anyone. But if no one does, then this winter'll be real cold." He said nothing, but in his eyes, for the first time, there was something that wasn't memory. It was now. The next day he built another chair. Didn't say why, just placed it beside his usual spot on the porch. 2 chairs now, one for himself, and one for someone else, someone who'd never left, or someone who had only just arrived, but had the courage to stay. January receded. The snow thinned, but the wind still carried the chill of things that had never been named. Elsie found her hand resting on her belly more often, not from fear and not quite from longing, but because at last there was a life she could love without needing permission. Gideon began working on the door to the west room. It had been shut for years, since the days when he still spoke to someone in the house with a voice warmer than the one he used now. The hinges were rusted. The paint had peeled. Dust lay thick as memory. No one asked what he was doing. He didn't explain, because in the West, the things that matter most don't need to be named. He set a chair between the door and the sky, nailed each plank slowly, scraped the walls clean, no rush, no noise, as if he were reclaiming something once lost, but not forgotten. Elsie stood quietly beyond the threshold. She didn't enter, didn't offer help, but each afternoon she brewed a cup of tea and placed it just outside the door. No one said a word, but kindness often begins with knowing how to protect another's silence. A few days later he unrolled the old rug, reassembled the bed frame, and brought back a cradle from the house down near the hill. The one that had belonged to a neighbor who left after the long winter 7 years ago. He did it all without fanfare, as if he'd once known, once hoped, but somehow everything that had waited had remained unfinished. And now, he wasn't fixing it to make amends. He was doing it to begin. One evening, he opened the door and pointed to the room. "The baby can stay here if you want." Elsie looked at him for a long time, then nodded. She didn't cry. There had been enough tears already, and now she needed both hands to hold what hope was finally being offered. Snow fell again. Not heavy like early winter, but heavy enough for a night it should have stayed away. Gideon woke to a sound, a quiet cry, not his name, but a sound he knew belonged to someone clinging to life. He threw on his coat, crossed the porch, and pushed open the door to the west room. The room he'd just finished mending. Elsie was slumped beside the bed, one hand wrapped around her belly, the other gripping the edge of the cradle no one had ever used. "I think it's time," she whispered. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Every breath, every tremble in that small room spoke louder than words. He lit the oil lamp and set it by the window, pulled out blankets, warmed water, dragged over the chair, and offered her his hand. No one knew if Gideon Ross had ever delivered a child. No one had taught him how to hold the hand of a girl becoming a mother. But that night he did something no man, no father, no stranger had ever done for her. He stayed. The hours passed like the edge of a cliff. She screamed, not from pain, but from the fear that she wasn't enough to bring a child safely into such a world. And Gideon, steady beside her, whispered 3 words he hadn't spoken in over 10 years. "You're not alone." Outside, the snow fell, like it was trying to bury the past. Inside, sweat, blood, and tears mingled into something primal, something sacred. Gideon wiped her brow with a trembling hand, poured water between her dry lips, held her legs down as her body threatened to bolt from its own pain. No one had taught him how, but he learned. By simply not leaving, and then, just as the sky began to pale from black to gray, the cry came, small, ragged, alive. Elsie collapsed, empty and shaking, and Gideon, for the first time in his life, held the living soul in hands that once dug his own grave. He placed the child in its mother's arms. Elsie didn't speak. She only looked at him, long and deep, as if, at last, someone had seen her, not as merchandise, not as baggage, but as a person, as a mother, as someone who had earned the right to go on living. That night they said nothing more. But after 10 long years, the house heard a sound it had not known in a decade, the cry of someone who had done nothing wrong to the world, except be born. By March, the sky had lifted, just a hand's breadth higher. The snow had melted late, leaving hairline cracks across the earth that had been frozen all winter. On the wooden porch, a chair rocked slowly, and an old man sat still. Before him, 2 cups of tea, one half drunk, one steaming. Nothing strange in that scene, except that, for the first time in 10 years, both cups had someone to drink them. The child, now just over 4 months old, crawled across a blanket on the porch, babbling sounds that meant nothing, yet eyes that already knew how to follow the light. A sudden, "Gah!" Then, "Gah! Gah, Grandpa!" Gideon looked up. Didn't move at first, but something shifted behind his weathered eyes. A glint of water not born of pain, but of something long buried rising again. The door creaked open. Elsie stood there, hands still wet, shoulder mended, hair tied up, and a smile. Not forced, not practiced, but real. "Your tea's getting cold," she said. He didn't reply, only nodded and poured more tea into her cup. Steam curled between them in the thin March air. And then 3 people, an old man, a young woman, and a child, sat side by side. And no one needed to say a thing. No one asked about the brother who sold her. No one spoke of the child's father. No one recalled the night the baby was born, or how Gideon's hands had trembled the first time he held something alive and breakable. Because the West didn't need the retelling. It only needed your presence. Gideon stood, stepped down into the yard, and began clearing the old garden bed. The child crawled after him. Elsie reached for the laundry. No promises were spoken, but the house, after so many years of dust and wind, now had someone who belonged to it, In the amber light of late afternoon, a traveler passing through the valley caught sight of smoke from the chimney, an old man pushing a swing for a child, and a woman pinning white cloth diapers on a line. He asked their names, but no one answered. They only said, "That's the man who used to live alone," until he paid $2 silver for a pregnant girl no one wanted. And then everything changed.